In June of 1987, Sarah Saganitso walked out of her job at the Flagstaff Medical Center in Arizona and was never seen again, alive. The next morning, her body was found, beaten savagely, mutilated, numerous stab wounds, and apparently a portion of her left breast had been eaten off or bitten off. Pretty soon, a professor at Northern Arizona University by the name of George Abney was arrested, charged, and put on trial. However, the defense countered that the circumstances didn't seem to look like he had been the murderer. Rather, they ran with a rather strange tact of blaming an Arizona skinwalker, a creature that adapts and changes their appearance and moves at incredible rates of speed and is known to be violent towards human beings. Abney was eventually acquitted, allowed to go free because evidence wasn't substantial. And to this day, no one knows who murdered Sarah Saganitso. Was it George Abney and he got away with it? Or was it an Arizona skinwalker who's still hungry for blood? This is Urban Legends Unmasked, and I'm your host, Chad Lerman. Today we're going to be looking at our third in a series of states and their urban legends. And this particular urban legend is going to kind of be our first for a couple of things. One, it's going to be the first real sort of true crime story that delves into this, where we actually have some documentation of this particular case. Not a lot, but there is some. But also we're going to be really looking at a legend that sort of is replicated throughout history, but at the same time, it's unique in this story. And there's several different variations and versions of how this occurs. And again, it's another legend that's not so much the traditional urban legend where there's this inherent moral, like don't go out at night with your boyfriend or girlfriend, don't chew gum at night when you sleep, don't mix candy and soda, like those kind of things. It doesn't have that. But it's still definitely an urban legend. It's still definitely a legend that affects the way society moves and operates in Arizona. So to kind of give you a little bit of a background, skinwalkers are very, very similar, if you will, to what we see in history like werewolves, in some variations of the lore, ghouls, where they are able to shapeshift. They're able to change into different appearances and different like forms, I guess you could say. So skinwalker tales are very often seen in the Southwest of America, specifically Arizona, which is why Arizona is the fortunate or unfortunate, depending upon how you look at it, one who gets the skinwalker tag. Now, it comes from Navajo culture. And there's this idea that there would be medicine men, legitimate religious leaders within the community who over time perhaps began to delve a little bit less into the good, clean medicine man stuff and a little bit more into that dark magic. And when they would do that, they might begin to go so far that they themselves became skinwalkers. Now, we see this a lot in some Native American legends. We see this obviously here with the skinwalker. We see it kind of with the Wendigo too, where an individual begins to go too far into the dark side. So the Wendigo, obviously, for those of you who are not aware, the Wendigo legend from Native American cultures is essentially that a human being consumed flesh and did so, or human flesh, and did so much that they turned into this sort of skeletal, strange, monstrous, cannibalistic thing that lives forever. Skinwalker is a little bit different. So Skinwalker is basically a magician, a medicine man, a holy man who goes too far and begins to delve into the darkness of things. They are sometimes referred to as and please, if I'm mispronouncing this, please forgive me, a Yanalduluski. That sounds very Russian for a Native American word. So I know I messed that up and I apologize for that. But the point is this. They are a practitioner of witchcraft. They will wear the skin of various animals, oftentimes coyotes, wolves, bears, crows, owls, and it says other creatures as well. Getting a lot of this information, by the way, from weirdus.com and their particular thing on skinwalkers. So when we look at this, it's this idea. You might have seen some imagery in movies where it's a Native American witch doctor who's wearing perhaps like a wolf head, and it kind of drapes down over their shoulders. Then, of course, with the skinwalker mystique, they would begin to adopt traits or abilities, including the sort of violent and animalistic tendencies of these things. Now, one of the things that I found very, very interesting is that there's a number of stories of people who are driving in the sort of vast stretches of openness in Arizona near Flagstaff or Tucson, some of the desert regions out there, where they're driving down the highway at a high rate of speed, say 60, 70 miles an hour, and they will hear a little tap on their window. And when they turn and look, they'll see a mostly human face, but very animalistic, perhaps bloody, perhaps like just terrifying, staring back at them. And then that form will then sprint off on their two little legs as fast as they possibly can off into the night. Now, first of all, I'm just going to say this. If I'm driving 70 miles an hour down the road and something taps on my window and I see a face, I don't care if it is a baby. I don't care if it's like my best friend. I don't care what. They are tapping on my window at 70 miles an hour. That in itself is a terrifying concept. So I'm not really seeing why we have to add, looks like a wolf or anything like that. Okay. So that's scary enough as it is. So it kind of plays into this lore idea, and I get a little bit of sort of almost a trickster sort of feel about this story. Just this idea that they seem to be very playful. They seem to want to mess with people, sometimes to the point of murder, which is where it brings us back to our original story, Sarah Saganitso. Now, the point of this is that everything I read to you was absolutely documented in numerous spots, down from her job as I believe she was a cleaning lady at the hospital, to the accused murderer, George Abney, a professor. There's also a story where Saganitsa's boyfriend was also accused, but it was discovered that he had been in a sweat lodge, like way away. Could not have possibly made that journey, whether he was a skinwalker moving at 70 miles an hour or not. So the basic thing is the story does exist. Notice I said the story, because when you start really digging into it, there's not a lot of evidence to support that this actually happened. Now, I've seen some indications that there are court records, but nothing that I've seen in my research really gives us a whole lot of information. That leads me to two conclusions. One, this is where we veer into Saganitso's story being a specific urban legend, actually an urban legend, like, oh my gosh, be careful of the skinwalkers kind of urban legend. Or somebody doesn't want this story to get out. Now, I realize what I just said sounds very conspiracy theory-like, and I apologize for putting that out there. But at the same time, if there were skinwalkers, if these were real things, these sort of terrifying, super fast, monster-looking things running around that are part human, I might not want to let people know about it, or would I? Would I want people to know that these things actually exist out there? So when I look at the particular legend here, and obviously we always try to tie this into sociology. We try to tie this back into the psychological aspects of things, like where would this come from? I can tell you that there are some situations in psychology where an individual person, and again, this is where we kind of bleed from straight skinwalker into sort of the idea of werewolfism or lycanthropy. There are some elements of this in psychology. There are some people who engage in very animalistic behavior from time to time. They become very bestial in their actions, their appearance. There have been documented cases of what we would call feral children. I believe Oksana, she was, I believe, from the Ukraine, was found to have been raised by dogs. This was back in the, I believe, 80s. And again, displayed very animalistic behaviors and like walked on all fours, didn't communicate, didn't speak, barked only, and those kind of things. So like there's definitely something out there that could exist where a person's psyche could be so altered either through trauma or through perhaps some sort of ingrained mental illness, perhaps some strange form of schizophrenia in which the person begins to believe something very different about their worldview. So there's definitely a psychological component that could explain perhaps some of this behavior of a person acting like an animal. Also, let's not forget drugs. Part of Native American culture, we do have things where they consume what we would call drugs today. There are different behaviors. They have visions that are encouraged or brought on by this. So if perhaps that chemical interaction interacted with a person who had a sort of latent psychological disorder, that might create this sort of break from reality, this dissociation with reality. From a sociological perspective, what does this do? I mean, this idea that anybody around you could be a skinwalker. They could be someone that they're not, or something that they're not. I think it begins to lead to an element of distrust. And perhaps that's really what this speaks to. You know, when you think back to the 1950s, you saw sort of the first emergence of these movies called The Invasion of the Body Snatchers. So The Invasion of the Body Snatchers was sort of the Western Eurocentric view, I guess, if you will, of skinwalkers. This idea that a body snatcher comes in, takes you, replaces you, and your friends and family don't know if it's really you or this pod person, this alien that has come in and taken over their place. I've been several versions or iterations of this movie, but it's interesting to note that these stories appeared first in the 1950s, at the height of the Red Scare, where people weren't sure who to trust. Were their neighbors really their neighbors, or were their neighbors Russian spies? Again, that played into the psyche of American culture. Perhaps that's a similar thing here. Perhaps within the Navajo traditions or the Navajo cultures, there was this sort of inherent warning to be careful. Maybe some of the less religiously inclined Native Americans looked at medicine men with distrust. I don't believe that these guys are doing what they say they are, and perhaps created stories that would make people a little bit more cautious of their medicine men. And maybe that's another factor too. Maybe part of the original legend, part of the original story does come about as a warning to medicine men, to religious figures, to these mystic men who perhaps might have been tempted to delve into the darker regions. And so, hey, you don't want to do that. You'll turn into a skinwalker, and you don't want to be trapped like that. So again, I think a lot of these stories do come from this sort of warning perspective, even though this isn't, like I said, a traditional urban legend. But I find the skinwalkers to be a fascinating sort of study. There's so many elements of this that are just inherently terrifying. The idea of a human being transforming themselves into something animalistic, losing control, like that's a common theme. I think throughout literature, throughout history, of people being afraid of that. I did mention one other thing in psychology. I mentioned this idea of lycanthropy, and that there have been some documented cases of people essentially thinking they were wolves. So there has been some psychology in that. There was a case in France, actually before psychology really even existed as a study, back in the 1700s, I believe, where a man seemed to think he was a wolf and murdered some people in such a state. So there is that kind of thing. So back to this. There is a quote here, again, finding it on weirdus.com in the story on skinwalkers. It ends sort of with this admonition, if you will. Just to be safe, it says, it might do to consider the advice of a Navajo student interviewed in 1977. If you ever see the skinwalker, just stand up to him. If you show him you're scared, man, he'll kill you. If you stand up to him and stare at him, he won't hurt you. Good advice, not just for skinwalkers, but for anybody who's trying to take advantage of you, abuse you, or hurt you. Don't show fear. And maybe that's the story. Maybe the story, maybe the legend, maybe the moral here that we should look at is, don't let your fears take over. Show them who's boss. Stand up to them. And don't ever, when someone taps on your window at 70 miles an hour, open that window. Whatever you do, just don't do that. It's bad. This has been Urban Legends Unmasked, and I'm your host, Chap Merriman. As always, feel free to check out some of the books that I've written located on Amazon. The Sawyer Shepherd Chronicle series, which is a supernatural thriller. There are no skinwalkers in there. However, there are some shapeshifters and werewolves and demons who inhabit other people. So great story to continue along with that. You can also check out Killtown. Again, no shapeshifters, pretty much just a straight serial killer competition, murder, like 6 murderers show up in a small town kind of thing. And then my most recent book, which will be out by the time this debuts, is known as Beneath These Brittle Bones, which is about actually kind of crosses over a little bit. You got a mystical person who goes a little too far, and they're murdered, and their body comes back to life and begins to take pieces of its victims to rebuild itself. Yeah, those are my stories. So feel free to check those out on Amazon. And again, I hope you have a great day, and whatever you do, don't let a skinwalker open your window on your car when you're driving down the highway.